I am astonished that so many people should care to hear this story over again. Indeed, this lecture has become a study in psychology. It often breaks all rules of oratory, departs from the precepts of rhetoric, and yet remains the most popular lecture in the 44 years of my public life. I have sometimes studied a year upon a lecture and made careful research, and then presented the lecture once, never delivered it again. I put much work on it, but this had no work on it, thrown together at random, spoken offhand without any special preparation, and yet it succeeds where the thing we study, work over, adjust to a plan is an entire failure. The title of this lecture originated back in 1869. The acres of diamonds which I have mentioned through so many years are to be found right here in your hometown or in the country where you live, and you are to find them. Many have found them, and what man has done, man can do. I could not find anything better to prove this true than by an incident I know of, and which I have told over and over again these many years, and which may be verified in almost any library. When going down the Tigris River, we hired a guide from Baghdad to show us down to the Arabian Gulf. That guide resembled the barbers we find in America. He resembled the barbers in certain mental characteristics. He thought it was his duty to guide us down the river, but also to beguile us with stories, ancient and modern, strange and familiar. But there was one that I would recall and tell you now. He told us that there once lived near the shore of the river Indus an ancient Persian by the name of Al-Hafed. He said that Al-Hafed owned a large farm with orchards, fields, and gardens, that he had money at interest, had a beautiful wife and lovely children, and was a wealthy and contented man. Wealthy because he was contented. One day there visited this old Persian farmer one of those ancient Buddhist priests, one of the wise men of the East, who sat down by Al-Hafed's fireside and told the old farmer how this world was made. He told him that it was once a great bank of fog, and that the Almighty caused a movement in this bank of fog, and began slowly to move it in a circle, and then to increase the speed until he whirled this bank of fog into a great ball of fire, that as it went rolling through space, burning other banks of fog, and then cooling, it condensed the moisture which fell in floods of rain upon the surface of the world, and cooled the outward crust. Then the internal, molten mass, bursting the cooling crust, threw up the mountains and hills and valleys of this wonderful world of ours. Then, if this molten mass burst forth and cooled quickly, it became granite. If it cooled less quickly, it became copper. If it cooled slowly, it became silver. More slowly, gold. And after gold, diamonds were made. That statement is literally true. The old priest told Al-Hafed that if he had a diamond the size of his thumbnail, he could purchase a dozen farms like his. And if you had a handful of diamonds, you could purchase the county. And if you had a mine of diamonds, you could command titles and thrones through the influence of your great wealth. Al-Hafed heard all about the diamonds that night and went to bed a poor man. He wanted a whole mine of diamonds. Early next day, he eagerly besought the priest and asked him where diamonds could be found. "Well," said the priest, "if you want diamonds, you'll have to find a stream of water that runs over white sands between high mountains. In those white sands you will always find diamonds." "Well," Al-Hafed said, "we'll see." And he sold his farm, left his family with relatives, and went off in search of diamonds. He began his search in the mountains of the Mesni. Afterwards he went into Palestine, and then wandered into Europe. He wandered on in a search for diamonds. At last, when his money was gone, and he was in rags and wretchedness, he stood on the shore at Barcelona, in Spain, where a great tidal wave swept through the Pillars of Hercules, and the poor starving stranger could not resist the temptation to cast himself into the sea, and he sank beneath its foaming crest, never to rise in this life again. When the old guide told me this much, he went on to say that the man who purchased Al-Hafed's farm led his camel out to drink one day, and as the animal put his nose into the shallow waters of the brook, the man noticed a flash of light from the white sands of the stream. Reaching down, he pulled out a dark stone containing a strange eye of light. He took it into the house as a curio and, putting it on the mantel, went his way and forgot about it. But not long after that, the old priest came in to visit the old farm. The moment he spied the curio and noticed the flash of light, he rushed about and demanded, "Here's the diamond! Here is the diamond! Has Alhafed returned?" "Oh, no, that is not a diamond. It is nothing but a stone we found out in our garden." "But," said the priest, "I know it's a diamond. I tell you it is a diamond." They rushed out into the garden and stirred up the sands, and they found other finer specimens. "Thus," said the guide, and friends, it is historically true, thus were discovered the diamond mines of Golconda, the richest diamond mines in all history. Verily, acres of diamonds. Yes, my friends, acres of diamonds. Every acre of the Golconda diamond fields has yielded diamonds that have decorated the crowns of monarchs. When the guide had told me this story, I told him it reminded me of an experience. I told him of a man in California who, in 1847, owned a ranch there. He heard that they had discovered gold in Mexico, and he hiked out to go there. He sold his farm to Colonel Sutter, who put a mill on the little stream below the house. One day his little girl gathered some of the sand in her hands from the raceway and brought it into the house. And as she was sifting it through her fingers, a visitor there noted the first shining scales of real gold ever discovered in California. Acres and acres of gold. I was introduced, in later years, to the one-third owner of that farm, and he was then receiving $120 in gold for every 15 minutes of his life, sleeping or waking. Professor Agassiz of Harvard once told us at their summer school of mineralogy that there once lived in Pennsylvania a man who owned a farm, who did with his farm what I should do if I had a farm in Pennsylvania. He sold it. But before he sold it, he decided to enter the business of collecting and selling coal oil. He wrote to his cousin in Canada that he would like to go into that business. His cousin wrote back, "I cannot engage you. You know nothing about the oil business." "All right," he said. "I can learn, and I shall learn all about the oil business." And he set himself to learn the whole theory of the coal oil business. He found that there was once another sun that shone on this world, and there were then immense forests of vegetation. He found that this other sun went out, and that this world in time fell into the wake of the present sun. It was then locked in ice, and there arose mighty icebergs, and as those mountains of ice rose over the stormy seas and crushed upon the earth, they pressed down all vegetation, planed down the hills, and everywhere buried this original vegetation, which gradually turned by chemical action into beds of coal, in connection with which is found coal oil in paying quantities. So he found out where oil originated. He studied it until he knew what it looked like, what it smelled like, how to refine it, and where to sell it. "Now," he said to his cousin, "I know all about oil, know it from the second day of God's creation to the present time." And now his cousin replied, "Come on." So he sold his farm in Pennsylvania for $833, even money, no cents. After he had gone, the man who had bought the farm went out to arrange for watering the cattle, and he found that the previous owner had attended to it. There was a small stream back of the barn, and across that stream was placed a plank at an angle for the purpose of diverting to one side of the stream a dreadful scum through which the cattle would not put their noses to drink, though they would drink in the clear place below the plank. And sure enough, the man who had gone to Canada, and who had learned all about oil, had been damming back oil for 23 years, oil which the state geologist said later was worth $100 million. Titusville. The city of Titusville stands on that farm now, and yet, though he knew well the theory of oil, he sold the farm for $833. Again, I say, no cents. I need another illustration. I find it in Massachusetts. A young man went down to Yale College and studied mines and mining, and he became such an adept at mineralogy that during his senior year in the Sheffield School, they paid him $15 a week for spare time teaching. When he graduated, they raised his pay to $45 a week and offered him a professorship. As soon as they did that, he went home to his mother. If they had raised his salary to $20, he would have stayed. But when they made it $45, he said, "I won't work for $45 a week. Let us go out to California and stake out gold and silver and copper claims and be rich." Said his mother, "Now, Charlie, it is just as well to be happy as it is to be rich." "Yes," said he, "it is just as well to be rich and happy, too." They were both right. And as he was the only son, and she a widow, he had his way. So they sold out in Massachusetts and went, not to California, but to Wisconsin, and there he entered the employ of the Superior Copper Company at $15 a week, but with the proviso that he should have an interest in any mines he should discover for the company. I don't believe he ever discovered a mine. Still, I have often felt when I mention this fact in northern Wisconsin that he might be in the audience and feel bad at the way I speak of this thing. For I know that he had scarcely gone from Massachusetts before the farmer who had bought his farm was bringing a large basket of potatoes through the gateway. You know, in Massachusetts, the farms have stone fences. Well, the basket hugged close to the gateway, and he dragged it on one side and then on the other. And as he tugged that basket through the gateway, the farmer noticed in one corner of the stone gateway a block of native silver, 8 inches square. And this professor of mines and mining mineralogy, when he sold that homestead, sat on that very stone to make the bargain. He was born on that farm, and they told me that he had gone by that piece of silver and rubbed it with his sleeve until it reflected his countenance and seemed to say to him, "Here, take me. Here is $100,000 right down here in the rocks just for taking." This was near Newburyport, Massachusetts. He wouldn't believe in silver at home. He said, "There is no silver in Newburyport. It is all away off somewhere else." And he was a professor of mineralogy. I don't know of anything I would more enjoy than taking the whole time tonight telling of the blunders that professors have made. I say I would enjoy it, but after all, there is another side to the case, for our friend out in Wisconsin may be sitting by his fireside tonight, with his friends gathered around him, and he may be saying to them something like this. "Do you know that man Conwell who lives in Philadelphia?" "Oh, yes, I have heard of him." "Well, you know that man Jones who lives in, Well, yes, I have heard of him too," say they. Then he begins to shake his sides with laughter, and he says, "They have both done the self-same thing I did precisely." And there you are, because you and I have done it. Yet nearly every person here will say, "Oh, no, I never had any acres of diamonds, or any gold mines, or silver mines." But I say to you that you did have silver mines, and gold mines, and acres of diamonds, and you have them now. You've all had opportunities to be rich, and yet to some of you it has been a hardship to buy a ticket for this lecture. Yet you have no right to be poor. It is all wrong. You have no right to be poor. It is your duty to be rich. Oh, I know well that there are some things more sublime than money. There are some things holier than gold. Yet I also know that there is not one of those things but is greatly enhanced by the use of money. Oh, you will say, "Mr. Conwell, can you, as a Christian teacher, tell people to spend their lives making money?" Yes, I do. You ought to make money. Money is power. Think how much good you could do if you had money now. Money is power, and it ought to be in the hands of good men. It would be in the hands of good men if we but comply with the Scripture teachings, where God promises prosperity to the righteous man. That means more than being goody-goody. It means the all-around righteous man. You should be a righteous man, and if you were, you would be rich. I need to guard myself right here, because one of my theological students came to me once to labor with me for heresy, I having said that money was power. He said, "Mr. Conwell, the Scriptures say that money is the root of all evil." I asked him, "Have you been spending your time making a new Bible instead of studying the one that we have?" He said, "That is in the old Bible." I said, "I would like to have you find it for me. I've never seen it." He brought a Bible, and he read quite plainly that the love of money is the root of all evil. And there it is. The love of money indeed is the root of all evil. The love of money, rather than the love of the good it secures, is a dangerous evil in the community. The desire to get money and hold on to it is evil and folly. It is a far greater ambition for men to desire money, that they may use it in great, wide service in the world. Young man, you may never have the opportunity to charge at the head of your nation's troops on some Santiago's heights. Young woman, you may never be called on to go out like Grace Darling to save suffering humanity. But every one of you can earn money, and with that money you can fight the battles of peace. And the victories of peace are always grander than those of war. I say then to you that you ought to have money and lots of it. Well, you say, I should like to be rich, but I have never had an opportunity. My friends, you did have an opportunity, and let us see where your mistake was. What business are you in? Oh, someone will say, I keep a store upon one of these side streets, and I am so far from the busy centers that I cannot make any money. Are you poor? How long have you kept that store? 20 years. 20 years and not worth $100,000 now? There is something the matter with you. Nothing the matter with the side street. It is with you. Oh, now you will say, anyone knows that you must be in the center of trade if you're going to make money. I do not admit that that is necessarily true at all. If you are keeping that store and are not making money, it would have been better for the community had you been kicked out of that store years ago. No man should be in business and not make money. No man has a right to transact business unless he makes something out of it. He has also no right to transact business unless the man he deals with has an opportunity to make something. Unless he serves in a way to be served in return, he is not really a man in business. You ought to have means. You have no right to keep a store for 20 years and still be poor. You will say to me, now, Mr. Conwell, I know the mercantile business better than you do. All right, my friend, let us consider it a minute. When I was young, my father kept a country store, and once in a while he left me in charge of that store. Fortunately for him, it was not often. When I was in charge, a man came in one day and said, Do you keep jackknives? No, we don't keep jackknives. And I went off and whistled a tune, and what did I care for that man? Then another man would come in and say, Do you keep jackknives? No, we don't keep jackknives. And I went off and whistled another tune, and what did I care for that man? Then another man would come in the same door and say, Do you keep jackknives? No, we don't keep jackknives. Do you suppose we keep this store open only to supply the neighborhood with jackknives? Do you carry on your business like that? Do you ask what was the difficulty with it? The difficulty was that I had not then learned that the foundation principles of business success and the foundation principles of Christianity itself are both the same. It is the whole of every man's life's work to be doing something useful for his fellows. And he who can do the most to serve, minister unto his fellows, is entitled to the profit and reward. Not only so saith God's holy book, but so saith every man's business sense. If I had been carrying on my father's store on a Christian plan, and one that leads to success, I would have had a jackknife for the second man when he called for it. But you say, I don't carry on my store like that. If you have not made any money, you are carrying on your very business like that, and I can tell you what you will say to me tomorrow morning when I go into your store. I come to you and inquire, Do you know neighbor Jones? Oh, yes, he lives up in the next block. He trades here at my store. Well, where did he come from? I don't know. Does he own his home? I don't know. What business is he in? I don't know. Do his children go to school? I don't know. What ticket does he vote? I don't know. What church does he go to? I don't know, and I don't care. Do you answer me like that tomorrow morning in your store? then you are carrying on your business just as I carried on my father's business in Worthington, Massachusetts. You don't know where your neighbor came from, and you don't care. You don't care whether he has a happy home or not. You don't know of his church or of other interests that are dear to him, and you don't care. If you had cared, you would have been a rich man now. You never thought it was any part of your duty to help him get on and do well, so you cannot succeed. It is against every law of business and every rule of success. What right have you to be in business, with no interest in people, and no endeavor to supply them what they need? You cannot succeed. That merchant who, in Boston, made his $15 million, began his enterprises out in the suburbs where there were not a dozen houses on a block, although there were other stores scattered about. He became, though, such a necessity to the neighborhood that when he wished to move into town to start a wholesale house, they came to him with a great petition, begging that he stay on and keep open his store for the good of the community. He had always looked after their interests. He had carefully studied what they wanted and had supplied them. He was genuine, he was likable, and they must make him wealthy. In proportion as you are of use to your fellow men, in that proportion can they afford to pay you. Oh, my friend, going through this world thinking you are unjustly dealt with, poor because you are not wanted. You should have made yourself necessary to the world, then the world would pay you your own price. Young man, remember when you go to invest your time, your talent, or your money, look around and see what people need, and then invest yourself or your money in that best and largest service. Then will your success be assured. Some young man will say to me, I cannot go into business. Why not? Because I have no capital. Capital? Capital? That is the cry of a fellow who cannot see over his collar. Who are the rich men now? The poor boys of 50 years ago. You know it. The rich men of your town, in whatever profession or calling, as a rule were the poor boys of 40 years ago. And the statistics of Massachusetts say, and I presume it holds good in other states, that not one rich man's son in 17 ever dies rich. To be rich in spirit is capital. Capital written across a man's face. To be actuated by some big, wholesome motive is capital. Capital and the wherewithal find their way into the hands of such people, those actuated to do things and render service. It is said that the elder Vanderbilt, when a boy, once went to his father and said, Father, did you earn all your money? And the old Commodore said, I did. I earned every penny of it. And he did. It is cruel to slander folks because they've been successful. It is a shame to look upon the rich the way we do. They are not scoundrels because they have money. They, more likely, have blessed the world. They have gone into enterprises that have enriched others, and the world has rewarded them. It is all wrong to accuse a man simply because he has money. Go through this city and your very best people among your richest people. Owners of property are the best of citizens. It is all wrong to say they are not so. The elder Vanderbilt went to his father and said, Did you earn all your money? And when the Commodore said that he did, the boy said, Then I shall earn mine. And he insisted and went to work for $3 a week. If a rich man's son will go to work like that, he will be able to take care of his father's money when the father is gone. If he has the bravery and the stuff to make his way as the poor boy must make it, then he will make good. It is not capital in money that is so necessary. It is rather the capital of personality, the capital of spirit, the capital of purpose. It is not copper sense, but common sense. It is not uncommon abilities, but common abilities, uncommonly spurred. Genius is 9/10 application. Let me mention another case. A.T. Stewart had $1.50 to begin life on. He lost 87 cents of this on his very first venture. He lost it because he purchased some needles and thread and buttons to sell, which people did not want, and he said, I will never do that again. Then he set about to find out what people wanted, and when he found out what they wanted, he invested his 63 cents and supplied a known demand. Why does one merchant surpass another? Why does one manufacturer outsell another? It is simply because that one has found out what people want and does not waste money on things they do not need. A.T. Stewart said, "I am not going to buy things people do not want. I will take an interest in people. I shall serve people in the very largest way." And he pursued that until he was worth $40 million. But you will say, I cannot do that here in this place. Yes, you can. It is being done in worse places than this, and you can do it, and can do it as well as others. We have a good example in John Jacob Astor, the elder. They say that he had a mortgage on a millinery store, and he had to foreclose the mortgage and go into business with the same people who had failed on his hands. After he entered the partnership, he went out and sat on a bench in the park. What was the successful merchant doing out there, in partnership with people who had just failed on his hands? He was out there watching the ladies as they went by. As he sat there, he watched, and if a lady passed by with her shoulders thrown back and her head up, and looking as though she didn't care if all the world did gaze on her, then John Jacob Astor studied the bonnet she wore. And before that bonnet was out of sight, he knew the shape of the frame, and the curl of the lace, and crimp of the feathers, and some of the intricate things that go into a bonnet. Then he went into his millinery store and said, "Now make up and put in the show window just such a bonnet as I described to you. I have just seen what that bonnet looks like on a lady's head." Then he went out and sat down again. Another lady of a different type and complexion came, and she wore another style of bonnet. He went back and described that bonnet and had one put into the window as well. He didn't fill his show windows full of bonnets and then sit down and complain because people passed by and went elsewhere to trade. He didn't have a hat or a bonnet that some lady didn't like. That firm has been the wealthiest millinery firm on the face of the earth. Out of that business, more than $17 million have been taken, yet not a dollar of capital was ever put into that business, except what they turned in from their profits to use as capital. John Jacob Astor made that millinery firm wealthy, not by lending them money, but by finding out what the ladies liked for bonnets. There was a man in Hingham, Massachusetts, who was a carpenter and out of work. He sat around the home until his wife got sick of seeing him and told him to go out of doors, and he did. He went out and sat down on the stoop, and he whittled out of an oak shingle a wooden chain. His children that evening quarreled over it, so he whittled another to keep peace in the family. While he was whittling the second toy, a neighbor came in and said to him, "Why don't you whittle toys on a big scale and sell them? You can make money." "Oh, no," the fellow said. "I could not whittle toys, and if I could, I wouldn't know what to make." He said he would not know what to make. His neighbors said to him, with good New England common sense, "Why don't you ask your own children what to make?" He started out and whittled out of firewood those Hingham toys, the wooden shovels, the wooden buckets, and such things, and when his children were especially pleased, he then made copies to sell. He started with little capital and secured a footlathe, and then secured a room, then hired a factory, and then hired power, and so he went on. The last law case I ever tried in my life was in the United States courtroom at Boston, and this very Hingham man who had whittled those toys stood upon the stand. He was the last man I ever cross-examined. Then I left the law and went into the ministry, left practicing entirely and went to preaching exclusively. But I said to this man as he stood upon the stand, "When did you begin to whittle those toys?" He said, 1870. Said I, "In these last 7 years, how much have those toys been worth?" He answered, $78,000. $78,000 in only 7 years, and beginning with nothing but a jackknife and a few $100s of debt that he owed people, and he was now worth at least $100,000. His fortune was made by consulting his own children in his own house and deciding that other people's children would like the same thing. You can do the very same thing if you will. You don't need to go out of your house to find where the diamonds are. You don't need to go out of your own room. Sit there in the quiet or in bed, lie there, with an open mind to sense things, a soul open to inspiration. There are things for you to do. There are acres of diamonds for you, closer than you dream of. But your wealth is too near. I was speaking in New Britain, Connecticut on this very subject. There sat 5 or 6 rows from me a lady. I noticed the lady at the time from her wealth of white hair. I said to them what I say to you now. Your wealth is too near to you. You are looking right over it." She went home after the lecture and tried to take off her collar. The button stuck in the buttonhole. She twisted and tugged and pulled and finally broke it out of the buttonhole and threw it away. She said, "I wonder why they don't make decent collar buttons." Her husband said to her, "After what Conwell said tonight, why don't you get up a collar button yourself? Didn't he say that if you need anything, other people need it? So if you need a collar button, there are millions of people needing it. Get up a collar button and get rich. Wherever there is a need, there is a fortune." And so she made up her mind to do it. And she invented the snap button, the two-piece button that snaps together and that first appeared as a glove button. That woman can now go to Europe in her own yacht and take her husband with her. And if he were dead, she would have enough money left to buy a foreign count or duke or some such thing. What is my lesson in it? I said to her what I say to you. Your fortune is too near to you, so near that you are looking over it. She had to look over it. It was right under her chin, and it is just as truly near to you. In East Brookfield, Massachusetts, there was a shoemaker out of work. His wife drove him out of doors with the broomstick because she wanted to sweep around the stove. He went out and sat down on the ash barrel in the backyard. Close by that ash barrel ran a little mountain stream. I have sometimes wondered if, as he sat there on that ash barrel, he thought of Tennyson's beautiful poem, "Chatter, chatter, as I flow, to join the brimming river. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever." I don't believe he thought of it, because it was not a poetical situation on an ash barrel in the backyard. But as he sat on that ash barrel, he looked down into the stream, and he saw a trout go flashing up the stream and hide under the bank. He leaped down and caught the fish in his hands and took it into the house. His wife sent it to a friend in Worcester. The friend wrote back that they would give $5 for another such trout, and the man and his wife started out to find one. They went up and down stream, but there was not another trout to be found. Then they went to the preacher, a preacher who was true to his profession. He pointed the way. He said, "Secure Seth Green's book on the culture of trout, and it will give you the information you need." They got the book and found that if they started with a pair of trout, a trout would lay 3,600 eggs every year, and that every trout would grow an ounce the first year, and a quarter of a pound every succeeding year, so that in 4 years a man could secure from 2 trout 4 tons of trout per annum to sell. They said, "Oh, we don't believe such a great story as that, but if we could raise a few and sell them for $1 apiece, we might make money." So they procured 2 little trout and put them in the stream, with a coal sifter down the stream and a window screen upstream to keep the trout in. Afterwards, they moved to the banks of the Connecticut River, and afterwards to the Hudson, and one of them has been on the United States Fish Commission, and he has held other high offices. But he sat that day on that ash barrel in the backyard, right by his acres of diamonds. He didn't see them. They were too close to him. It may be that you too will not find your wealth until your wife or some other friendly good fortune opens your eyes. But nevertheless, your wealth is there, awaiting you. The people, though, who make the greatest mistakes are the farmers. When I could not keep my father's store, he sent me out on the farm, knowing that, as the ground was nearly all rock, I could not do much harm there. I know by experience that a very ordinary man can be a lawyer. I know also that it doesn't take a man with a gigantic intellect to be a preacher. It takes brains, though, to be a successful farmer today. The farmer will be more successful when he gives more attention to what people want and not so much to what will grow. Now, the great aim of most of our farmers is in seeing what will grow. I was going through Iowa a while ago, and seeing the wheat decaying in the mud, I said to a farmer, "Why is it that all this grain here is decaying?" "Oh," he said, "it is the awful monopoly of the railroads." He didn't use the word awful, but he used a word that he thought was more emphatic. I got into the train, and I sympathized with the poor downtrodden farmer. The conductor came along, and I asked him, "How much of a dividend does this railroad pay on its stock?" "Dividend? Why, it hasn't paid a dividend in 9 years, and it's been in the hands of the receiver most of that time." Then I changed my mind. If that farmer with others had raised what the people wanted, not only would he have more money, but the railroad would have paid dividends on its stock. I was at Evansville, Indiana later, and a man drove up in a big car and told me, 18 years ago I borrowed $200 and I went into farming. I began the first year to raise wheat, rye, and hogs. But the second year I decided to raise what the people wanted. So I plowed the ground over and put in small fruits. Now I own this farm and a great deal more. They told me at the hotel that he owned 2/3 of the stock in the bank of which he is president. He had made his money all because he served. He planted what people wanted. He did what people wanted done. Let me go down through this audience now and ask you to show me the great inventors here. You will say, that doesn't mean me. But it does mean you. You inventors right before me now. Oh, you will say, we don't have any inventors here. They all live away off somewhere else. But who are the great inventors? Always the men who are the simplest and plainest. They are the great inventors. The great inventor has the simple mind and invents the simplest machine. Did you ever think how simple the telephone and the telegraph are? How simple the greatest principles are? Now, the greatest mind is always the simplest. Did you ever see a really great man? Great in the best and truest sense? If so, you could walk right up to him and say, "How are you, Jim?" Just think of the great men you've met, and you find this true. I went out once to write a biography of General Garfield, and I found him crowded with other people. I went to a neighbor's to wait until they were gone. But the neighbor told me that if I wanted to see him, I'd better go over at once, and he offered to introduce me. He took his old hat and stuck it on the back of his head, and climbed over the fence and went to the back door of the house and shouted, "Jim! Oh, Jim!" Very soon Jim came to the door, and the neighbor said, "Here is a man who wants to see you." I went into the home of one of the greatest men that ever lived. To his neighbors he was Jim, a plain man, a simple man. I went to see President Lincoln once, when I was an officer in the War of 1861. I had never seen him before, and his secretary sent me in to see him as one would enter a neighbor's office. Simple, plain old Abe. So plain and simple that even as president you stood before him at ease. The greatest men are the simplest always. Did you ever see a man strut along, puffed up in his ego, not willing to notice an ordinary mechanic? Do you think he's great? Do you really think that fellow great? He's just full of balloon juice, held down by the weight of his feet. I asked a class in Minnesota once who were the great inventors, and a girl hopped up and said, "Columbus." Columbus was a great inventor. Columbus married a wife who owned a farm, and he carried it on just as I carried on my father's farm. We took the hoe and went out and sat down on a rock. But as Columbus sat on that rock on the island of Puerto Santo, Spain, he was thinking. I was not. Columbus, as he sat on that rock, held in his hand a hoe handle. He looked out on the ocean and saw the departing ships apparently sink into the sea, and the tops of the masts went down last, out of sight. Said Columbus, "This world is like a hoe handle. The further off, the further down. The further off, the further down. Just like a hoe handle. I can actually sail around to the East Indies." How clear it all was. Yet how simple the mind. It is the simplest minds that observe the simplest things, that accomplish the greatest marvels. I went up into New Hampshire once, and when I came back, I said I would never go to New Hampshire to lecture again. And I said to a relative of mine, who was a professor at Harvard, "I was cold all the time I was there, and I shivered so that my teeth shook." Said he, "Why did you shiver?" "Because it was cold." "No, that is not the reason you shivered." Then I said, "I shivered because I had not bedclothes enough." "No, that's not the reason." "Well," said I, "Professor, you are a scientific man. I am not. I would like to have an expert, scientific opinion now, why I shivered." He arose in his own way and said to me, "Young man, you shivered because you did not know any better. Didn't you have in your pocket a newspaper?" "Oh, yes, I had a Herald and a Journal." "That is it. You had them in your pocket, and if you had spread one newspaper over your sheet when you went to bed, you would have been as warm as you lay there, as the richest man in America under all his silk coverlids. But you shivered because you didn't know enough to put a 2-cent newspaper on your bed, and you had it in your pocket. It is the open-mindedness to little things that brings human success. How many women have been inventors because of this trait in them? I read in a newspaper the other day that no woman ever invented anything. If that is so, who invented the jacquard loom? Who invented the printer's roller? A woman. Who invented the cotton gin? Mrs. Green, although a patent was taken out later on an improvement in Mr. Whitney's name. Who invented the sewing machine? A woman, Mrs. Howe, the wife of Elias Howe. If a woman can invent a sewing machine, if a woman can invent a printing roller, if a woman can invent a cotton gin, she can invent anything under heaven. Our civilization would roll back if we should cross out the great inventions of women, though the patents were taken out often in the names of men. The greatest inventors are those who see some simple need, and then invent something to supply that need. Inventors are usually persons with minds receptive to receive ideas. Most of the greatest inventions have come to us by accident, and ever so many, through hunches, through inspiration, through prescience, those qualities of the open-minded. Do you know that if I were to go through this house and shake hands with each of you and say, "Introduce me, please, to the great men and women in this hall tonight," you would say, "Inventors? We don't have any here." If you want to find inventors or find great men, you would have to go far elsewhere. Great men always come from somewhere else. How many of us know the latent powers of our own people here about us? And here is the place for them to be great. There are as great men here as in any other place of its size. But it is so natural for us to believe that great men come from afar. They come from London, from Rome, from San Francisco, from New York, from Manayunk, or somewhere else. But there are just as great men here tonight as there are anywhere else in the world. Most men are pygmies of their possible selves because they don't themselves suspect their untouched powers. Families do not credit their own folks with abilities they attribute to other persons. Towns and cities are cursed because their own people talk them down. We teach our young people to believe that all the great people are of the past. I heard a professor in an Illinois college say that nearly all the great men are dead. We don't want that man in Philadelphia. They don't want him anywhere. I have to say tonight that the great men of the world are those who are the great mediums and transparencies for good, the great producers and great distributors of goods or services to the greatest numbers. These men are the men who epitomize service. Some man is saying, "We may one day have a great man here, although I don't know of any now." My friend, when are you yourself going to be great? When I am elected to some political office, then I will be great. Oh, my friend, learn right now, in these exciting times, that to hold political office is no evidence of greatness. Why, my friends, what would become of this nation if our great men should all take office? Suppose you select the greatest men of your city right now and ask them to leave their enterprises and go into public office. My friends, the great men cannot afford to take public office, and you and I cannot afford to put them there. Young man, greatness is intrinsic. It is inherent in man. If you are not great as an individual before you enter public office, you may rattle around in it once you get there. There are greater things than political office. Many a man's fortune has been made by being defeated when he was up for public office. You never saw a truly great man in office who did not take the office at a sacrifice to himself. Another young man says, "There is going to be a great man here." When? When there comes a war. When we get into another world conflict, then I will sweep up among the glittering bayonets. Then I will tear down their flag from the staff, bear it away in triumph, and come home with stars on my shoulders, and hold every office in the gift of the nation. Then I will be great. My friends, please remember that greatness does not consist in holding office, even in war. The office does not make the great man. But, alas, we mislead the young in teaching history. If you ask a pupil in school who sank the Merrimac, he will answer Hobson, and will tell you 7/8 of a lie. For 8 men sank the Merrimac at Santiago. Yet where are the women here tonight who have kissed the other 7 men? A young man says, "I was studying the history of the war the other day and read about Generals Grant and Meade, Beauregard and Hood, and Pershing, these great leaders, and they were great. Did you read anything about their predecessors? there is very little in history about them. If the office had made the possessors great, you would not have heard of Grant or Sherman or McClellan. They would be great intrinsically, not made so by office. Every general of the war is credited with victories he never knew anything about, simply because they were won by his subordinates. It is unfair to give the credit to a general who did not know anything about it. I tell you, if the lightning of heaven had struck out of existence every man who wore shoulder straps in our wars, there would have arisen out of the ranks of our private soldiers just as great men to lead the nation to victory. I'll give one more illustration. I don't like to give it. I don't know how I ever fell into the habit. Indeed, it was first given offhand to a Grand Army post of which I was a member. I hesitate to give it now. I close my eyes, and I can see my own native hills once more. I can see my hometown and its buildings and the town hall. They are there, spread before me with increasing detail as the years fly by. I close my eyes, and I can see again our homecoming from the Civil War, with the crowds gathered and flags flying, the bands playing. I can see a platoon of soldiers who have returned from one term of service to re-enlist for another, to be received by the town authorities. Oh, well do I remember the day. I was the captain of the company. Although in my teens, I was marching at the head of that company and puffed out with ego. I am ashamed of the whole thing now. But what pride was mine, marching at the head of my troops. We marched into the town hall. They seated my soldiers in the middle of the hall, and the crowds came in on the right and on the left. Then the town officers filed in and took their position in a half circle. The good old mayor of the town sat there in his dignity with his powerful spectacles. He had never held office in his life before. He had never held office and had never made a speech before. When he had taken his place, he saw me on the front seat, and he invited me up on the platform with the selectmen. Invited me, up on the stand with the town officers. Why, no town officer ever took any notice of me before I went to war. Now I'm invited to stand on the stand with the selectmen. I sat down, let my sword fall to the floor, and waited to be received. Napoleon V. When the selectmen and their mayor had taken seats, the mayor waited a while and then came forward to the table. And that speech! He had written out his speech and had learned it by heart, but he brought his manuscript with him very wisely and spread it on the table. Fellow citizens, he said, we are very happy. We are very happy to welcome back to their native town these soldiers who have fought and bled and are back again in their native town. We are especially pleased to see with us tonight this young hero, whom we have seen leading his troops on to the deadly breach. We have seen his shining sword, flashing in the sunlight as he shouted to his troops, "Come on!" Oh, dear, dear, dear. He was a good old man, but how little he knew about war. If he had known anything about war at all, he ought to have known that it is next to a crime for an officer of infantry in time of danger to ever go ahead of his men. I, with my shining sword flashing in the sunlight, and calling to my troops, "Come on!" I never did it. Never once did it. Do you suppose I would go in front of my men to be shot in front by the enemy, and in the back by my own men? The place for an officer in time of danger is behind the private soldier. It is the private soldier who faces the enemy. Often, as a staff officer, I have ridden down the line before the battle, and as I rode I have given the general's order, shouting, "Officers to the rear!" And then every officer goes behind the line of private soldiers, and the higher the officer's rank, the further behind he goes. It is the place for him, for if your officers and your generals were killed, where would the plan of the battle be? How ashamed I was of the whole affair. Some of those men had carried that boy across the Carolina rivers. Some of them had given him their last draught of coffee. One of them had leaped in front of him and had his cheekbone shot away. He had leaped in front of the boy to save his life. Some were not there at all, and the tears that flowed from the eyes of the widows and orphans showed that they had gone, never to return. But in the good man's speech he scarcely noticed those who had bled and died. The hero of the hour was that boy. I do not know now where many of my comrades sleep. They went down to death. Sometimes in my dreams I call, "Answer me, ye sighing pines of the wilderness. Answer me, ye shining sands of the seashore. Answer me, ye crags and rocks of the continent. Where sleep my dead?" But to my call no answer comes. I know not where many of these men now rest, but I do know this: they were brave and genuine. They went down fighting for a cause we believed to be right. Yet the hero of the hour was this boy. He was an officer. They were only private soldiers. I learned a lesson that day I will never forget, that greatness consists not in office or position. Greatness consists in doing great deeds with little means, in the accomplishment of vast purposes. It consists in the private ranks of life, in helping one's fellows, benefiting one's neighborhood, and in blessing one's own city and state.